Thank you very much. The topic today before us is stated as, is religious extremism or secular extremism the problem? Actually, this is a difficult topic to argue, because if you argue that religious extremism rather than secular extremism is the problem, then it sounds as if you are in favor of Jerry Springer and bald-headed pop-singing tarts and things like that, when actually the case is neither religious extremism or secular extremism is the problem, but rather, quite clearly, from the statements of those who are fighting against us, the problem is Islamic jihad. Islamic jihad is an imperative rooted within the Islamic religion. Jihad means struggle in Arabic. The only meaning of jihad is not military. However, there are an abundance of passages from the Quran, the Muslim holy book, and the Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad, as well as all the teachings of the teachings of all the schools of Islamic law, that stipulate that it is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community to wage war against unbelievers in order to establish over them the hegemony of Islamic law. This is not the twisted Wahhabi version of a tiny minority of extremists. It is taught by all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, and all the sects of Islam that are considered orthodox by Muslims hold to this view. Now, the question before us really, however, is why is it that we're seeing an explosion of this kind of activity over the last quarter century, when if you went back before that to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, you didn't see Islamic jihad terrorism dominating the headlines the way you do today. And the contention of Mr. D'Souza, I don't mean to, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you will, is that the depravity of American popular culture has, among other things, contributed to a feeling among Muslims worldwide that they are threatened, that their traditional cultures are threatened, and that therefore they have to lash out. There is actually some truth to that. There's no doubt that the depravity of American pop culture is indeed used as a pretext by the Islamic jihadists. However, it must be borne in mind that the Islamic jihad has always been pursued whenever Muslim states and communities have had the means to pursue it. They did not have that means until the last 25 years in the modern era, until the Saudis struck oil. The Khomeini revolution in Iran gave a tremendous impetus to the jihadists, because it showed them that they could govern a state. They could win and govern a state. The Saudis have been incredibly instrumental in funding jihad activity worldwide. And this is the ultimate reason why we're seeing this explode in the world today. Finally, the thing is this. The Islamic texts mandate warfare against unbelievers, not just immoral unbelievers, but all unbelievers, regardless of how moral or wonderful they may be.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. Next up, our next guest is Mr. Dinesh D'Souza.
If you look at our enemies in Iraq, the reason they feel a sense of victory is not because they are capable of defeating the U.S. military, but because they know that in America, support for the war hangs in the balance. In other words, the Iraqi insurgents know that there is an active secular left in this country that is trying to convince the Congress and ultimately the president to get out. So if they win in Iraq, it will not simply be because of their efforts, but also because of the collaborative help that the enemy abroad is getting, if you will, from the enemy at home. Now, some people have taken my book to be saying, in a sense, that because I'm pointing a finger at the cultural left, that I'm denying in some inane way that bin Laden and his co-conspirators knocked down the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. They did it. But it is not an unintelligent question to ask, what are the conditions that put radical Islam in a position to be strong enough and emboldened enough to carry out that attack? Wasn't it the policies of Jimmy Carter in withdrawing American support for the Shah that helped install the Khomeini regime in place? Wasn't it the impotence, if that's the right word, of the Clinton administration in the 1990s that emboldened bin Laden? By his own token, he says, we were emboldened when we saw the cowardly response of the Americans to strike. Now, I want to make a point about this issue of cultural depravity. There are two groups in the Muslim world. There are the radical Muslims, and there are the traditional Muslims. One thing I'm going to be arguing is that we cannot win the war on terror without driving a wedge between these two camps. Ultimately, traditional Islam is the recruiting pool of radical Islam. Only by dividing those two groups can we win long term. Thank you.
I'm going to go to you with the first question, and that is your book, and having reviewed your book, you lay a lot at the feet of the liberals and the left. And while I may not be crazy about liberals and the left, I'd be hard-pressed to blame them for what 19 hijackers did on 9/11. Care to comment?
If one were trying to understand the rise of Nazism and Hitler's invasion of Poland and France, it would not be an unintelligent question to ask, what role did European appeasement in the 1930s play in consolidating the position of Hitler and emboldening him to do what he did? If it was not for the appeasement of the Europeans, maybe Hitler would not have taken the steps that he did. So my argument is that radical Islam, once a very marginal force in Islamic society, has gained enormous traction in the last couple of decades. One reason for it is liberal foreign policy, which has strengthened the position of radical Islam. The other reason is that liberal values projected abroad. And I'm not just talking about Britney Spears, by the way, or Hollywood. I am talking about an aggressive global campaign on the part of international leftist groups to promote secularism, feminism, homosexuality, all kinds of ideas that, look, we can debate them here in America, but when you go outside of America, to Africa, to Asia, to China, to India, to the Muslim world, these are seen as a shameless and shocking assault on the values of people who live in very traditional societies. So we've gotten a backlash from that.
Thank you, Dinesh. In reading your books, Mr. Spencer, you contended, as you did in your opening statement, that devout Muslims are commanded in every school of thought to fight and even indeed kill non-believers. I was never taught that growing up as a Muslim. As a matter of fact, I read in the Quran, "Do not contend with the people of the book." I didn't say that. Except, okay, well, in the fairest way. So what did you say, and what can you explain that comment?
Yeah. In the first place, though, I'd like to say a couple things are not at issue here. I don't think that it's any point of debate or that Mr. D'Souza and I have any disagreement over the disastrous policies of the Carter administration or the disastrous policies of appeasement that are being pursued by the cultural left. Those things, sure, we are 100% in agreement. What we're in disagreement about is the prospects of these traditional Muslims who we are urged to ally with. I'm just not sure that they want to ally with us. And this is getting back to your question, Mr. Khan. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, told his followers, and this is in a hadith, Sahih Muslim 4294, if you'd like to look it up, is he told them to meet the unbelievers, invite them to Islam. If they refuse the invitation to Islam, then to offer them the second-class status of the Dhimma, the protected group, the so-called protected people who are second-class citizens and denied equality of rights under the law with Muslims, or third, to go to war with them if they refuse both conversion or subjugation. These things are taught in all the schools of Islamic law to this day. This doesn't mean that every Muslim holds to them, and this is where we come back to the traditional Muslims. When I asked Mr. D'Souza in an earlier engagement if he could name a traditional Muslim, he gave me Ali Goma, the Mufti of Egypt. Unfortunately, the Mufti of Egypt has issued a statement in support of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a terrorist group. Hassan Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah, is on video shouting "Death to America." I doubt that that's really a very fruitful possibility for alliance.
Thank you, Mr. D'Souza.
I'm Spencer.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Spencer. Mr. D'Souza, Mr. Spencer is contending that we would have difficulty in the West with aligning with traditional Muslims. Is that, in fact, something that is impossible, or what's your argument?
Historically, I think that the error that Spencer makes, if I may say so, is he ransacks the Quran He finds all the violent passages in it. He ignores all the peaceful passages in it. He looks at the early conquering zeal of Islam for the first few hundred years, starting about the 7th century. Then he fast forwards, jumping over about 1,000 years, right to the modern age, and he basically says, Bin Laden is right. Bin Laden is right in usurping and appropriating the entire Muslim tradition. When Bin Laden says, I'm doing nothing more than what the Quran says, Spencer is there applauding on the sidelines, because he agrees with the Bin Laden interpretation of Islam. Now look, unlike Spencer, I grew up in that world. I grew up in India, which has 200 million Muslims, almost as many as the entire Middle East. We often think of the typical Muslim as someone in a white sheet with little eyes staring through, living in Saudi Arabia. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. The second is Bangladesh. There are lots of Muslims in Turkey. So I think that what we are getting here is a distorted picture of the Muslim world, and it has disastrous consequences for us as conservatives, because when we go around attacking Islam, we are alienating traditional Muslims and pushing them into the radical camp by attacking their religion and their values.
Thank you, Mr. D'Souza.
Look to respond to that?
Feel free, take a minute.
Sure, thanks. The question here is what the content of Islamic teaching is, and that is a matter of objective record. I doubt that, with respect, that Mr. D'Souza has actually read any of my books, or he wouldn't make these claims that I'm picking out negative passages from the Quran and from Islamic tradition when I'm only reporting on what they say. I said in the beginning that the 4 Sunni schools of Islamic jurisprudence, the Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, and Hanafi, as well as the Shiites, they all teach this thing. So in other words, it's not something that is just bin Ladenism, it is mainstream Islam. And the idea that we are attacking them by telling the truth about what Islamic teachings are, well, I think that's absurd.
Thank you. And I'll offer a rebuttal to Mr. D'Souza.
For every kill the infidels passage in the Quran, you can find a matching slay the infidels passage in the Old Testament. Don't interrupt me. Don't interrupt me. The issue I want to get at is not what the Quran says, slay the infidels. Now, the Muslims have had historically many empires, the Umayyad, the Abbasid, the Ottoman Empire. The Muslims ruled northern India for 200 years. They ruled about 40 million Hindus. They could have slain them. They could have killed them. They could have forced them to convert. They did nothing of the sort. So what I'm getting at here is we're getting, if you will, a certain kind of, let's read the Quran and pick out a passage without looking at how these passages have actually been interpreted through Islamic history. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there aren't problems with Islamic teaching. I am simply saying that this root and branch attack on Islam, the Prophet Muhammad was the founder of terrorism, the Quran is a gospel of violence. We are setting up to have a war with 1 billion Muslims. That is a very stupid war to fight. It's an unnecessary war. It's the wrong war.
Mr. Spencer, let me ask you a question, and you can maybe
sure.
incorporate your answer into both.
I will.
If in looking at, right now we are faced with an enemy that we must destroy, but in looking at different instances of the history, we see the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. They were the first to engage in suicide bombing. In 1946, there was a King David bombing where terrorists killed over 90 people, including Jews, Arabs, Christians, and British soldiers there. We see terrorism, of course, between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. Would those be characterized as Catholic terrorism or Hindu terrorism or Jewish terrorism?
Thank you for the question, because this is a common thing that is said. Actually, no, they would not be characterized as Catholic or Jewish or Hindu terrorism, precisely because the people who carry out the acts of terrorism in those instances do not adduce the religious texts of their respective religions to justify their actions, whereas the Islamic terrorists do that, and they do that in great detail. Once again, Mr. D'Souza has brushed past my point about the teachings of Islam. I am talking precisely about what he says we ought to be talking about, and that is how these texts have been interpreted throughout Islamic history. Unfortunately for Mr. D'Souza, these passages that I supposedly cherry-pick out of the Quran that are violent are the ones, precisely the ones, that in traditional and mainstream Islamic theology, according to the doctrine of nasikh or abrogation, are considered to cancel out the peaceful verses and leave the jihad warfare imperative as the word for all time. Now, that doesn't mean that every Muslim is going to be following that out, but that is mainstream Islamic teaching. This is a matter of record. Look at the Islamic text yourself.
All right, this time we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to offer, if you'd wait for a second, Mr. D'Souza, I'm going to offer each of you a 2-minute closing.
I just want to rebut his.
Well, maybe if you include that in your closing, and then we'll have a 1-minute rebuttal to the closing. You want to go first then, Mr. D'Souza?
I'm sorry. Well, can I answer him before doing my closing? Because otherwise I'll use up my closing swatting him down.
Well,
so,
I have to be fair.
all right.
You have 2 minutes.
Look, we agree that there is a problem with the Islamic radicals using the Quran to justify their deeds. We also agree that this group has become very powerful in the Muslim world. That's a real danger. Spencer admits, he'll say, well, not every Muslim, as though there are 3 Muslims who have not yet joined radical Islam. There are, in fact, many Muslims who have not. Now, I ask you this, Spencer, if those guys were in this room listening to you denouncing Muhammad as the founder of terrorism, attacking the Quran, wouldn't the effect of your books collectively be to polarize those guys, push them away from American conservatism, and push them closer to the Islam? You're basically saying that the only good Muslim is a non-Muslim.
It's easy to set up a straw man and knock it down. It's harder to deal with what I'm actually saying. Now, the fact is that I never said Muhammad was the founder of terrorism. To say that would be asinine. But Muhammad did mandate warfare against unbelievers. It's in the Quran also. And it is abundantly clear from the teachings of all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence. Now, what does that mean that we should do? Should we avoid saying anything about this in order to keep from offending the sensibilities of Muslims? It would seem to me that on the basis of simple human decency, as well as simple adherence to reality, we ought to be calling upon Muslims of goodwill to examine these elements of Islam that are giving rise to violence and to repudiate them, and to adhere to the canons of human rights that are universally accepted in the world, even in large parts of the Islamic world. And then, in other words, to look at the texts of the Quran and the example of Muhammad is not insulting or disrespectful. It is a matter that any sincere Islamic reformer would be completely behind, because obviously you cannot reform something that you won't admit needs reforming and that you won't acknowledge needs careful examination. And so the idea that these people abhor jihad, but if you talk about Muhammad, then they will become jihadists, is completely silly. If they really abhor jihad, then no matter how insulted they are, they're not going to join it. And so Mr. D'Souza's own argument illustrates the fact that there is widespread support for this, unfortunately, among his so-called traditional Muslims, like the Grand Mufti of Egypt. And so I am calling for Muslims of goodwill, like my friend Ahmed Yunus in the crowd here, and others, to honestly discuss the elements of Islam that are inspiring the jihad terrorists, that Osama bin Laden is quoting, that all the others are quoting all the time, and making recruits among Mr. D'Souza's traditional Muslims on that basis, and to come up with some positive way, instead of denying that these elements exist, come up with some positive way to deal with them so that we can live in peaceful accord.
Somewhat like the mosquito in the nudist colony, I'm trying to decide where to begin. But look, it seems to me that Spencer is, on the one hand, claiming something, and with the other hand, taking it back. Who are these traditional Muslims? That's what seems to be the heart of the matter here. To read Spencer's books, you would think most of these Muslims are radicals. They read the Quran. It fires them up. I have read them. Look, you're always interrupting me. Most Muslims in the world today live in democratic societies. If that surprises you a little bit, it's because you've never read it in Spencer's books. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, a democracy. There are Muslims in Turkey, which is another democracy. India is democratic. My point is simply this, that we are having debates. Is Islam compatible with democracy? when the majority of Muslims today are running in elections, stepping down when they lose, and so on. My point is these are people that we can work with. The radical Muslims are courting them. We don't want to push them away, because ultimately, even if we kill 1,000 radical Muslims, it's no good if 10,000 traditional Muslims sign up the next week. I am saying that as conservatives, if we were winning this war, you could say, why are we listening to a new strategy? We're not doing that well. We are bringing very few converts in from the left, and we are increasing anti-Muslim sentiment, which the radical Muslims are exploiting over there. So I think that conservatives, or some of us, have been unintelligently fighting this war, and by understanding it better, I think we can fight it better. Thank you.